The iron gates of Hawthorne Manor didn't just creak, they groaned like a soul in torment. For Isadora Vance, the sound was a warning she couldn't afford to heed. Rain lashed against the small carriage that had carried her from the ruins of her life in London to the desolate cliffs of Cornwall. She was a woman with no references, a name she had changed 3 times in as many months, and a secret that would see her in Newgate prison if the law ever caught up to her. To the world, she was a quiet, modest governess. To herself, she was a survivor. As the carriage pulled up to the looming, ivy-strangled mansion, Isadora felt the weight of the silence here. Hawthorne Manor was a place where light seemed to die. It belonged to Alaric Thorne, the Earl of Hawthorne, a man the newspapers called the Beast of the Coast. Rumor had it that he had returned from the wars not just physically scarred, but mentally broken, locking himself away in the West Tower, refusing to see a single soul except for his young, orphaned niece. Isadora stepped out into the mud, clutching her thin shawl. She wasn't met by a line of servants, but by a single, grim-faced housekeeper who didn't offer a word of welcome. She was led through cold, cavernous halls where the portraits had been turned toward the wall. It was a house in mourning, not for a person, but for hope itself. When she was finally shown to her room, the housekeeper pointed to a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. She warned Isadora never to knock on that door. That was the Earl's sanctuary, and he did not tolerate intruders. But Isadora had always been an intruder. That night, unable to sleep as the storm rattled her window, she heard a sound that didn't belong in a house of stone, a violin. The music was jagged, beautiful, and filled with a longing that made her heart ache. Drawn by a force she couldn't explain, she found herself standing before the forbidden door. The music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was terrifying. "Who is there?" a voice rasped from behind the wood. It wasn't the voice of a beast, but a man who had forgotten how to speak to the living. Isadora didn't run. She leaned her forehead against the cool oak and whispered that she was the new governess and that she had never heard a more beautiful song. There was a long pause, and then the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back. The door opened just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness and the scent of old parchment and sea salt. The Earl told her that if she stayed, she must promise one thing: never to look at his face. Isadora agreed, her heart hammering. She didn't know then that Alaric Thorne wasn't hiding his scars. He was hiding a scandal that involved the very man Isadora was running from. 2 broken souls were now under one roof, and the storm outside was nothing compared to the secrets about to collide. The following morning brought a gray, mist-laden light that barely penetrated the heavy velvet curtains of Hawthorne Manor. Isadora began her duties with the Earl's niece, a quiet girl named Clara, who seemed as haunted as the house itself. Clara rarely spoke, but she clutched a small silver locket as if it were her only lifeline to the world. As they sat in the dusty schoolroom, Isadora noticed that the child's drawings weren't of dolls or flowers, but of a tall man standing in a forest of thorns. "Is that your uncle?" Isadora asked softly. Clara nodded, her eyes wide. "He says the thorns protect us, Miss Vance. He says the world outside is where the monsters are." Isadora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. She knew all too well that the monsters didn't always stay outside. Sometimes they wore fine silk and sat in the highest courts of London. While Clara napped in the afternoon, Isadora found herself wandering the corridors she had been told to avoid. Her footsteps were muffled by the thick, moth-eaten carpets. She reached the west wing, where the air grew colder and smelled of ozone and brine. At the end of a long gallery, she found a door left slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she discovered a small, private study. The room was a graveyard of memories. Crates of war medals lay discarded in the corner, tarnished and forgotten. But what caught Isadora's eye was a desk cluttered with old correspondence. On top of the pile lay a letter with a seal she recognized instantly, the crest of the Duke of Arysdale, the man who had destroyed her family. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. The letter was dated 5 years ago and mentioned her father's name, accusing him of a treason he had never committed. A floorboard creaked behind her. Isadora spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. In the shadows of the doorway stood a tall, broad-shouldered figure. He stayed in the darkness, his face obscured, but his presence was overwhelming. "I told you never to wander, Miss Vance." The Earl's voice vibrated through the room, deeper and more dangerous than it had been the night before. Isadora didn't drop the letter. Instead, she held it up, her voice shaking but defiant. "My father was an honorable man, my lord. Why do you have a letter that calls him a traitor?" The silence that followed was thick with unspoken pain. The Earl moved slightly, the light catching the glint of a silver ring on his hand, a ring her father had once described in his journals. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he took a step forward, still keeping his face in the gloom. "There are truths that act as slow-acting poisons, Isadora. If you value your life, you will put that paper down and forget you ever saw it." He stepped closer, and for a fleeting second, Isadora saw a glimpse of his jawline, strong and rugged, but marred by a jagged scar that disappeared into his collar. He wasn't a beast. He was a man who had been shattered by the same hand that had broken her. Before she could speak, he reached out and snatched the letter, his fingers brushing hers. The heat of the contact sent a jolt through her, a spark of life in a house of death. He slammed the door shut, leaving her alone in the hallway with a new, terrifying realization. Her employer didn't just know her secret, he was a part of it. The atmosphere at Hawthorne Manor grew heavier, as if the very walls were leaning in to listen to their secrets. 2 days passed without a glimpse of the Earl, yet Isadora felt his presence everywhere, in the fresh wood placed by her fire and in the rare books left outside the schoolroom door, their pages marked at her favorite passages of poetry. On the 3rd evening, a formal note was delivered on a silver tray. It was an invitation to dine with the Earl in the great hall. There was one condition: the room would remain unlit, save for a single candle on each end of the long mahogany table. Isadora dressed with care, choosing a simple gown of deep forest green. When she entered the hall, the darkness was nearly absolute. The vast space swallowed the light of the 2 flickering candles. At the far end of the table sat Alaric, a silhouette against the gloom. Between them, a tall silk screen had been placed, ensuring that even in the dim light, his face remained a mystery. "You possess a rare courage, Miss Vance," Alaric began, his voice reflecting off the stone walls. "Most would have fled Hawthorne Manor the moment they heard the rumors, yet you stay, digging through letters that do not belong to you." "I am not looking for gossip, my lord," Isadora replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I am looking for justice. My father died in disgrace because of the Duke of Arysdale. If you have proof of his innocence, why hide it in a drawer?" The sound of a silver fork hitting a plate echoed like a gunshot. "Because the truth is a double-edged blade," Alaric rasped. "The same evidence that clears your father's name would reveal my own failure. I was the officer assigned to protect the documents your father was carrying. I failed. I was ambushed, my men were slaughtered, and I was left with these—" He paused, and she could almost feel him gesturing to the scars he hid. "Arysdale didn't just steal the letters, he stole my honor." As the meal progressed, the tension shifted from suspicion to a strange shared intimacy. They spoke of the poets they loved, of the music he played in the dead of night, and of the crushing weight of living a lie. For a moment, the screen between them seemed to vanish. They weren't an earl and a governess. They were 2 survivors finding a bridge across the darkness. But the peace was shattered by a frantic pounding at the heavy front doors. The housekeeper hurried in, her face ashen. "My lord, there are men at the gate. They claim to be from the High Sheriff's office in London. They say they are looking for a fugitive named Isadora Vance." Isadora stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. The candle at her end of the table flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. "Stay where you are," Alaric commanded. The sound of him rising was powerful, the movement of a soldier preparing for battle. "They will not enter this house. No one takes what is mine." For the first time, he stepped around the screen. In the fading light of the last candle, Isadora saw him, not a monster, but a man whose scars told a story of sacrifice. He looked at her, his eyes burning with a protective fire. "Go to the schoolroom, lock the door. I will settle the debt I owe your father tonight." The thunder that shook Hawthorne Manor was no longer just the product of the Cornish sky. It was the sound of the past finally catching up to the present. As the heavy iron knocker struck the front door again, the sound reverberated through the hollow stone of the foyer like a death knell. Isadora stood frozen in the great hall, the scent of the Earl's sea salt cologne still lingering in the air where he had stood just moments before. "Go, Isadora." Alaric's voice was a low growl, more command than suggestion. "Clara is frightened. She needs you. I will deal with the ghosts at the gate." Isadora fled up the grand staircase, her skirts gathered in her hands. She burst into the schoolroom to find young Clara huddled beneath the heavy wool blanket, her eyes wide and glassy with terror. The child knew the sound of those boots, the heavy, rhythmic thud of men who came to take things away. Isadora pulled the girl into her arms, whispering words of comfort she didn't entirely believe herself. "Is it the monsters, Miss Vance?" Clara whimpered. "No, darling," Isadora said, her eyes fixed on the door. "It is just the wind and the rain. Your uncle is the strongest man in Cornwall. He won't let the storm inside." Downstairs, the heavy oak doors were thrown open, admitting a swirl of freezing rain and 3 men wrapped in sodden, caped greatcoats. At their head was a man Isadora would have recognized anywhere, Mr. Silas Vane, the Duke of Arysdale's most ruthless fixer. He was a man with a smile like a razor and eyes that saw people only as obstacles or assets. Alaric Thorne stood in the center of the foyer, his feet planted firmly on the stone floor. He had not donned a mask or retreated to the shadows. He stood in the full, flickering light of the chandelier, his scarred face exposed and his hand resting on the hilt of a cavalry saber that hung from his belt, a relic of the wars he had tried to forget. "You are trespassing on private property, Mr. Vane," Alaric said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "I am here on the authority of the High Sheriff, my lord," Vane replied, his eyes roaming the hall with practiced greed. "We are searching for a thief, a woman by the name of Isadora Vance. She stole a collection of private correspondences from the Duke of Arysdale, letters that contained sensitive matters of state." "There are no thieves in this house, only my household, and as the Earl of Hawthorne, my word is the law within these walls. You have no warrant signed by a local magistrate, and you have no right to cross my threshold." Vane stepped forward, his boots squelching on the rug. "We know she is here, Thorne. Don't let your misplaced sense of chivalry destroy what little remains of your reputation. The Duke is a powerful friend and a devastating enemy." "The Duke," Alaric spat the name, "is a man who builds his house on the bones of better men. I served with Isadora's father. I saw the documents he carried. They weren't matters of state. They were proof that Arysdale was selling secrets to the French. My scars came from the ambush Arysdale ordered to silence us. I may have failed to protect the papers then, but I will not fail to protect his daughter now." While the confrontation escalated below, Isadora's heart raced. She knew Alaric could only hold them for so long. She looked around the schoolroom, her mind searching for a weapon, a way out, anything. Her gaze fell upon the small silver locket Clara was clutching. "Clara, let me see that for a moment," Isadora said gently. The girl handed it over. Isadora turned it over in her hand. It was an unusual piece, heavy and cold. She noticed a small, nearly invisible seam along the edge of the silver casing.
Using a sewing needle from her kit, she pricked the catch. The locket didn't hold a portrait. It held a tiny, tightly coiled piece of vellum, the final page of the ledger her father had died to protect. Her father hadn't hidden the proof in a safe or a bank. He had hidden it in the one thing he knew his granddaughter would never lose. As she unrolled the parchment, the ink, though faded, clearly showed Arisdale's signature beneath a list of troop movements and gold payments. A crash sounded downstairs, the sound of a table being overturned. Vane's voice rose in a snarl. "Search the house. If the Earl interferes, arrest him for obstruction." Isadora knew she couldn't stay hidden. If they found her with the paper, both she and Alaric were lost. She tucked the vellum into her bodice and turned to Clara. "Hide in the wardrobe, darling. Don't come out until your uncle calls for you. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, scrambling into the dark cupboard. Isadora took a deep breath, straightened her shawl, and stepped out into the hallway. She didn't head for the back stairs. She walked straight toward the landing of the great hall, looking down at the chaos below. "Mr. Vane," she called, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even her. Every head in the foyer snapped upward. Alaric looked at her, his expression a mix of horror and admiration. Vane's face twisted into a triumphant grin. There she is, the little bird in her cage. Isadora descended the stairs slowly, her eyes locked in Alaric's. "You want the letters, Mr. Vane? You want the truth. It's here. But you will never take it back to Arisdale, because the Earl isn't the only one who survived that night on the coast. The truth survived too." Alaric moved with the speed of a predator, stepping between Isadora and the men. He drew his saber, the steel singing as it left the scabbard. "You heard the Lady Vane. The game is over. You leave this house, or you leave it in a pine box." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a wire pulled so tight it was screaming. Vane looked at the saber, then at the determined woman on the stairs, and finally at the Earl, who looked ready to tear the world apart to keep her safe.
The air in the foyer was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the shadows. Then the violence erupted. Silas Vane didn't wait for a formal duel. He lunged forward, reaching for a pistol tucked inside his greatcoat. But Alaric was faster. With the fluid, brutal grace of a man who had survived the slaughter of the Peninsular War, the Earl swung his saber. The flat of the blade caught Vane's wrist with a sickening crack, sending the pistol skittering across the stone floor. Vane's men, hardened mercenaries in the Duke's employ, drew their own blades, their faces twisted in grim determination. "Isadora, get back!" Alaric roared, his voice booming over the wind. He met the first mercenary's charge with a parry that sent sparks flying into the air. Despite his limp, Alaric moved with a terrifying precision. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the honor he thought he had lost 5 years ago on a blood-soaked road. He was a sentinel at the gates of his own redemption. Isadora didn't flee. She knew that if Alaric fell, there would be nowhere left to run. Her eyes darted around the hall, landing on the heavy brass fire poker near the hearth. She snatched it up, her knuckles white. As a second mercenary tried to circle around Alaric to strike him from behind, Isadora stepped into the light. With a cry of defiance, she swung the heavy brass rod, catching the man across the shoulder. He staggered, his aim ruined, giving Alaric the opening to disarm him with a swift, punishing kick. "Enough!" Vane screamed, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of primal rage. "You think a bit of steel can stop the Duke? You are dead men, all of you!" Vane lunged for the fallen pistol with his good hand, but Isadora was quicker. She stepped on the weapon, her gaze meeting Vane's with a coldness that matched the Cornish winter. "The Duke's power is built on lies, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice echoing with the authority of the truth she carried in her bodice. "And lies cannot survive the light." At that moment, the back doors of the hall burst open. The housekeeper and the few remaining stable hands appeared, armed with pitchforks and heavy iron tools. They had lived in fear of the beast for years, but seeing their master standing as a shield for the innocent had finally broken the spell of his isolation. They weren't just servants anymore.
They were a garrison. Seeing the tide turn, Vane's men faltered. They were paid to bully, not to die for a duke who would disavow them the moment things went south. One by one, they lowered their weapons, the clatter of steel on stone sounding like the final notes of a funeral dirge. Alaric stood panting, his saber lowered, but his eyes still fixed on Vane. The blood from a small cut on his forehead trickled down his scarred cheek, making him look truly formidable. He walked toward Vane, the tip of his blade hovering inches from his throat. "You will leave," Alaric whispered, the calm in his voice more terrifying than any shout. "You will return to Arrasdale and tell him that the beast of the coast still has his teeth. Tell him the documents he fears are no longer hidden. By dawn, a rider will be on his way to the Prince Regent with the proof of his treason." Vane looked at the circle of angry faces, at the defiant woman, and at the man who had found his soul in the middle of a storm. With a final hissed curse, he turned and stumbled out into the rain, his men following like beaten dogs. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Alaric slathed his sword, his hand trembling slightly. He turned to Isadora, his gaze searching hers. For the first time, he didn't try to turn away his scarred side. He stood before her, broken and whole all at once. "Is it true?" he asked softly. "You have it? The final page?" Isadora reached into her bodice and pulled out the small, coiled vellum. "My father never failed you, Alaric, and you never failed him. He knew you would be the only one strong enough to protect his daughter and his legacy." As the first light of a gray morning began to bleed through the high windows, the shadows of Hawthorne Manor finally began to recede. But the danger wasn't entirely over. Arrasdale was a wounded animal, and a wounded animal was most dangerous when cornered. The ride to London was a blur of steel-gray skies and the rhythmic thundering of hooves. Alaric had refused to let Isadora go alone, mounting his swiftest stallion and leading a small, armed escort of his most loyal men. In his breast pocket sat the silver locket and the vellum from the locket, the ghost of a treason that had haunted them both for 5 long years. They reached the capital just as the sun was setting, the golden light reflecting off the white stone of the Admiralty. The Duke of Arrasdale was not a man who expected a confrontation. He was a man who expected obedience. When the doors to his private study were thrown open, he didn't even look up from his desk, assuming it was Vane with the girl in tow. "Did you bring her?" the Duke asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I brought something better, Arrasdale," Alaric's voice boomed, echoing through the opulence of the room. The Duke froze. He looked up to see Alaric Thorne standing in the doorway, his scarred face held high, with Isadora Vance by his side. The Duke's face went from arrogance to a sickly pale gray as Alaric tossed the silver locket and the vellum on the mahogany desk. Behind them stood the king's messenger, whom Alaric had summoned the moment they entered the city gates. The evidence was undeniable. Within an hour, the man who ruled London through fear was led away in irons, his legacy of shadows dismantled by a single page of truth. The scandal that had broken Isadora's father was finally reversed, and the beast of the coast was heralded as the hero who had never stopped fighting for the crown. A month later, the spring sun finally broke through the stubborn Cornish mists. Hawthorne Manor was no longer a tomb. The ivy had been trimmed, the windows thrown open, and for the first time in a generation, the sound of laughter echoed through the great hall. Isadora stood on the cliffs, the salt spray catching in her hair. She heard a footstep behind her, a steady, confident stride. She didn't have to turn to know it was Alaric. He stood beside her, looking out at the vast blue Atlantic. The scars on his face were still there, but the darkness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady peace. "The village is calling you the Lady of the Light," Alaric said, reaching out to take her hand. His touch was no longer hesitant, it was sure. "And what do they call you?" Isadora asked, a playful smile pugging at her lips. Alaric looked at her, the woman who had seen past his shadows and taught him to live again. He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers in the bright morning light. "They call me a man who was lost at sea until he found the only star worth following." As the bells of the village chapel rang out for a wedding that would be talked about for decades, the shadows of Hawthorne Manor were gone for good. The scandal was buried, the secret was told, and the Duke and his governess walked back toward their home, hand in hand, into a future that was finally, beautifully their own.